They called it a transaction, a simple settling of debts in the high country of Colorado, where the law was as thin as the mountain air. But for 19-year-old Clara, it was a death sentence disguised as a trade. On a freezing November afternoon in 1885, the man who should have protected her, her own father, looked a stranger in the eye and sold his daughter for a winter's supply of flour and whiskey. She was labeled broken goods. Useless, they said, because of a twisted leg that had marked her since birth. Her parents thought they were discarding a burden. The stranger, a legendary recluse named Elias Thorne, a man who hadn't spoken to a civilized soul in years, thought he was buying a servant to scrub his floors. But neither of them knew that this cruel bargain was about to unleash a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the frontier. What happens when the beast of the mountain discovers that the broken girl he bought is the only one strong enough to save him? You are not going to believe how this story ends. Before we climb further into this tale of survival and redemption, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories. It helps us keep these forgotten tales alive and convinces the algorithm to share this history with the world. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your flag or your city in the comments below. Now let's head into the high lonesome. The wagon wheels groaned in protest, a sound like dying thunder echoing off the granite canyon walls. It was a treacherous ascent, the kind of trail that discouraged honest men and swallowed the dishonest ones whole. Inside the back of the swaying buckboard, Clara clutched her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fabric was threadbare, a faded gray that matched the ominous sky above, offering little defense against the biting wind that whipped down from the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep in her heart. 3 days ago, the world she knew had ended. It wasn't a world of kindness, but it was familiar. Now even that was gone. She could still hear her father's voice, raspy from cheap liquor and years of resentment, sealing her fate in the back room of the settlement's trading post. The memory played in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. "She's of no use to a working farm," he had grunted, not even looking at her as he spoke to the trader. "Legs twisted, can't carry a full load, but she can cook and she's quiet. Take her off my hands and the debt is cleared." She wasn't a daughter to him. She was a ledger entry written in red ink, a failed investment in a harsh world where children were expected to be labor assets. In the eyes of the frontier, where a person's worth was measured in bushels of corn harvested or logs split, Clara was a deficit. Her mother had stood by the stove, wiping her hands on a stained apron, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. That silence had hurt more than the words. It was the silence of complicity. The wagon lurched violently over a granite slab, throwing Clara against the rough wooden slats. Pain shot up her left leg, the one that had been twisted since birth, but she didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that noise only invited sharper rebukes. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the horizon, watching the tree line shift from the golden aspens of the lower valley to the dark, brooding spruce and fir of the high alpine. They were entering the high lonesome, a place where civilization faded into myth and the rules of society were replaced by the laws of survival. The driver, a man named Murphy who smelled of chewing tobacco and old grease, hadn't spoken a word since they left the valley floor. He seemed anxious to drop his cargo and retreat before the snows came. And the snows were definitely coming. The air smelled of ozone and ice, that metallic tang that precedes a heavy fall. "There it is," Murphy muttered, pointing with his whip handle toward a ridge that seemed to hang in the sky. Thorne's Folly. Clara shifted to look. Clinging to the side of a sheer granite face, sheltered by a copse of ancient ponderosa pines, sat a cabin. It was not the tumble-down shack she expected. It was a fortress of hewn log and stone, built with a precision that spoke of immense strength and patience. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, promising warmth, but the structure looked imposing, isolated and utterly silent. It looked like a place where secrets went to be buried. As the wagon clattered into the clearing, the heavy oak door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out. If the cabin was a fortress, this man was the garrison. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that strained the seams of his buffalo hide coat. A beard, thick and dark as a bear's pelt, obscured half his face, but his eyes were visible even from this distance. Pale blue, piercing and devoid of warmth. This was Elias Thorne. The locals whispered that he was a relic of the old fur trade. a man who refused to die out with the beaver. They called him the Ghost of the Ridge, because he moved through the woods without breaking a twig. Murphy halted the horses, his hands shaking slightly on the reins. The animals blew steam from their nostrils, sensing the tension. Brought her just like agreed. "Thorne," Murphy called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Debt's paid. I ain't staying for the storm." Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked to the wagon, his boots crunching heavily on the frozen ground. He didn't look at Murphy. He looked straight at Clara. She shrank back, instinctively trying to hide her left leg beneath the folds of her skirt. The shame was a reflex now, drilled into her by a mother who sighed every time Clara stumbled and a father who mocked her uneven gait. She waited for the look of disgust, the sneer of disappointment. When he realized he'd purchased damaged goods, he prepared herself for the rejection. That always came, but Elias didn't sneer. He just watched her, his gaze intense and calculating, like a wolf assessing a new arrival to its territory. He reached up a hand, large, scarred, and rough as tree bark, and rested it on the wagon's side. "Wah!" he grunted, a sound of surprise common among the old mountain men. "You're smaller than a starving coyote." "Benjamin said you were sturdy." I can work, sir," Clara whispered, terrified that he might send her back to a father who no longer wanted her. "I may be small, but I am strong." "Can you walk?" His voice was a deep rumble, vibrating in the cold air. "Yes, sir, I limp, but I can walk." Elias nodded once, then climbed down. "Storm's coming. We don't have time to palaver." He didn't offer to help her down, but he didn't rush her either. He stood back, giving her space. Clara maneuvered herself to the tailgate, gritting her teeth as she lowered her weight onto her bad ankle. Pain shot up her leg, familiar and sharp, but she forced herself to stand upright. She would not fall, not here, not in front of him. She smoothed her skirt, standing as tall as her 5-foot frame would allow. Murphy didn't wait. As soon as Clara's boots hit the dirt, he slapped the reins and turned the wagon around, eager to flee. Clara watched him go, the last tether to her old life snapping with the crack of the whip. She was alone with the wind, the mountains, and the ghost of the ridge. "Inside," Elias said, turning his back on her. "Heat escapes, and out here heat is life." Clara followed him. The cabin interior was a shock to her senses. She expected squalor, the dirty, chaotic den of a wild man living off grease and grit. Instead, she stepped into a space of rigorous order. The floorboards were swept clean. Tools hung on the walls in precise descending order of size. The scent was not of unwashed bodies, but of pine resin, wood smoke, and curing leather. A fire roared in the hearth, battling back the mountain chill. "Sit," Elias pointed to a rough-hewn chair near the fire. Clara sat, her hands trembling in her lap. She felt like an intruder in a bear's den. Elias moved to the stove, pouring a dark liquid from a battered tin pot into a mug. "Your father," Elias began, his back to her as he stoked the fire, "said you were silent. Said you wouldn't be a bother." "I try not to be, sir," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Elias turned, leaning against the heavy oak mantel. "I didn't buy you, girl. Whatever that man told you, whatever lies he spun to salve his conscience, I don't buy people. Slavery is dead and good riddance. I paid his debt because he was going to send you to the workhouse in Denver, and a girl with a twisted leg wouldn't last a week in those mills." Clara looked up, stunned. "Then, why am I here?" "Because I need someone to manage the cabin," Elias said, his voice hardening again, masking whatever kindness might have been beneath. "I run trap lines that take me out for days. The place needs keeping. The hides need curing." "Can you work?" "I can sew," Clara stammered. "I can cook. I know herbs. My grandmother taught me the old ways." "We'll see," Elias grunted. "There's a room in the back. You stay there. You do your share, you eat. You don't, you leave. That's the law of the stick. Nothing survives up here that doesn't pull its weight. Understand?" "Yes, Mr. Thorne." "Elias," he corrected. "Mr. Thorne is a name for tombstones." As Clara retreated to the small back room, she felt a strange sensation. It wasn't relief exactly. Fear still coiled in her stomach. But for the first time, the transaction wasn't about her being a burden. It was a challenge. Pull your weight, and you survive. She looked at the small cot in the corner, covered in a buffalo robe. She wasn't a daughter here. She wasn't a cripple here. She was a survivalist, and she would prove she could survive. The first morning broke not with sunlight. but with a gray, pearlescent haze that signaled deep winter. The cabin was cold. The fire had banked down to coals during the night. But Clara was awake before the frost could settle on her quilt. She knew this was the test. Elias had said it clearly, you do your share, or you leave. She dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers stiff as she laced her boots. By the time Elias emerged from his sleeping loft, the fire was roaring again, and the smell of frying salt pork and cornmeal mush filled the small space. It was a humble breakfast, but the warmth it brought to the room was luxurious. Elias stopped at the bottom of the ladder, sniffing the air. He looked at the fire, built exactly right, high, enough to heat the skillet but controlled, enough to save fuel. He looked at Clara, who was standing by the stove, favoring her good leg. She had already swept the hearth and set the table. "Coffee's ready," she said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Elias grunted, taking the cup. He took a sip. It was good, strong, hot, and without the grounds he usually choked on. "Snow's deep," he said, staring out the frosted window pane. "Goats need feeding. Water bucket's empty. Spring is a quarter-mile down the ridge." It was a dismissal and a dare all in one. Can the cripple make the climb? Can the girl who was sold for flour haul her own weight in water? Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and the heavy wooden bucket. "I'll see to it." Stepping outside was like walking into a wall of white. The air was so cold it felt solid, burning her lungs with every breath. The snow was knee-deep in places, a treacherous powder that hid rocks and roots. Clara's left foot dragged, catching in the drifts. Every step was a battle. Her ankle throbbed, a dull ache that sharpened into a spike of pain with every uneven placement. But she refused to stop. She visualized her father's face, his dismissal of her, and used that anger as fuel. She made it to the goat shed, her breath coming in ragged clouds. She moved among the animals with a gentle confidence. She pitched the hay and broken the ice in their troughs. The goats bleated, welcoming her. They didn't care about her leg. They only cared about her hands, which were kind and capable. Then came the spring. The path down the ridge was steep and slick with ice. Elias watched from the window, hidden by the shadows of the cabin interior. He saw her stumble. He saw her fall hard, the bucket clattering away into the brush. He tensed, his hand reaching for the door latch. He expected tears. He expected her to sit there and wait to be rescued, just as every person from the civilized world seemed to expect. But Clara didn't cry. She lay in the snow for a moment, gathering her strength. She checked her ankle, painful but functional. Then she rolled over, pushed herself up on her hands and knees, and crawled to retrieve the bucket. She used a sapling to pull herself upright, dusted the snow from her skirt, and continued. Elias pulled his hand back. "Wah," he whispered to the empty room. "She's got grit." When she returned, nearly an hour later, she was pale and shaking. But the bucket was full. She set it down by the door, refusing to spill a drop. The water sloshed, icy and clear. "Water," she rasped. "And the goats are fed." Elias looked at the water, then at her. He saw the tremor in her legs. He didn't praise her. Praise made people soft. But he walked over, picked up the bucket with one hand as if it weighed nothing, and set it on the table. "Stew tonight," he said. "Venison. Needs potatoes peeled. Onions chopped. Can you handle a knife better than you handle a hill?" "I can handle a knife," she said, pulling her grandmother's small paring knife from her pocket. That evening, the cabin felt different. Clara went to work on the venison stew, a staple of the mountains, but one she elevated with care. She cut the meat into 1-inch cubes, searing them in the bacon grease to lock in the flavor, just as her grandmother had taught her. She added the onions, letting them caramelize until they were sweet and brown, then tossed in the precious dried herbs she had found in jars on the shelf. Thyme, marjoram, and a pinch of dried sage. Elias sat cleaning his rifle, the smell of the stew filling the cabin. It was a rich, savory scent that spoke of home, something this cabin hadn't smelled like in years. He watched her peel potatoes with a dexterity that surprised him. Her hands were small, but they were efficient. There was no wasted movement. "You learned that somewhere," he observed, the rhythmic shuck-shuck of the peeling knife filling the silence. "Most folks just boil the meat gray." "My mother," Clara said, keeping her eyes on her work. "She said if I couldn't run, I'd better be useful with my hands. Said a sitting woman still eats, so she'd better work twice as fast." "Your mother sounds like a hard woman." "She was practical," Clara replied. "Life on the frontier doesn't leave room for softness. If you can't pull a plow, you'd better be able to cook for the man who does." No, Elias agreed, setting his rifle down. It doesn't. But there's a difference between hard and cruel. The mountain is hard. It kills you because it doesn't care. People are cruel because they choose to be. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw something behind the ice in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, a grief that sat heavier on his shoulders than any buffalo coat. Is that why you're up here, Elias? To get away from the cruelty? Elias stood up abruptly. I'm up here because it's quiet, and because the mountain doesn't lie to you. The stew won't cook itself. He turned away, but Clara noticed he didn't retreat to his loft immediately after eating. He stayed by the fire, whittling a piece of pine, while she sewed a tear in his spare shirt. The silence between them wasn't companionable yet, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two wary creatures deciding to share a shelter against the storm. Clara realized then that her challenge wasn't just to survive the elements. It was to navigate the frozen landscape of this man's heart. And for the first time in her life, she felt she might just have the tools to do it. By the fourth day, the cabin was no longer just a home. It was a capsule floating in a white void. The blizzard had descended with the fury of a biblical plague. The snow didn't fall. It was driven horizontally by winds that screamed like banshees, burying the windows and banking high against the sturdy oak door. Inside, Clara moved with a quiet superstition common to the mountain folk. Elias watched from his chair as she sprinkled a line of salt across the threshold and mixed a small amount of indigo powder with milk in a saucer. With her finger, she painted a small, subtle symbol on the upper frame of the door. What's that for? Elias asked, pausing in his work. He was sharpening his skinning knife, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound competing with the wind. To keep the haints out, Clara said softly, using the old word for restless spirits. My grandmother said the blue tricks the spirits into thinking it's water. They can't cross water. And the salt? Well, salt purifies. Elias chuckled, a low rumble in his chest that sounded rusty from disuse. The only spirits up here are the wind and the wolves, Clara, and neither of them care about blue paint. Maybe. Clara smiled faintly, wiping her hand on her apron. But it doesn't hurt to be careful. Sometimes the things that haunt us aren't wolves. Sometimes they're memories, and memories are harder to keep out than snow. Elias went quiet at that. He stared into the fire, his knife still. He looked at the book sitting on the high shelf, a volume of poetry, its spine cracked and worn. That was my wife's, he said suddenly. Mary Catherine. The name hung in the air, fragile as smoke. Clara held her breath. She loved that book, Elias continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. She used to read it aloud, before the fever took her, 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Clara said, her heart aching for the giant man who suddenly looked very small. I can put it back if it bothers you. No, read it. The house has been too quiet. A house without a voice is just a tomb. So Clara reached up and took the book. She sat by the fire and began to read. She read of ancient battles and loves lost, her voice steady and soothing, filling the empty spaces that had haunted Elias for 5 years. He sat in his chair, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of the words. It was a form of courtship, though neither would admit it, a sharing of souls through the safety of another's words. When she finished, Elias stood up and went to the window, scraping a small hole in the frost to peer out. You're not what I expected, Clara. I thought I was taking in a charity case, someone to look after. But you have a way about you. You make the quiet feel peaceful instead of lonely. They blamed me, Clara confessed, the secret spilling out before she could stop it. For the accident. They said I fell from the loft because I was clumsy. But I didn't fall, Elias. My father, he was drunk. He pushed me. I was 9. Elias gripped the window frame until his knuckles turned white. The wood creaked under his pressure. If he ever steps foot on this mountain again, he said, his voice lethal, he won't walk down it. It was a vow. For the first time in her life, a man was using his strength not to hurt her, but to shield her. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling. But the mountain has a way of testing vows. As the storm raged on into the 5th day, the woodpile next to the stove dwindled. The cold began to creep in from the corners of the room. I'm going to the wood store, Elias announced the next morning. It's buried under the drift on the north side. Stay inside. Let me help, Clara said, standing up. 2 pairs of hands are better than one. No, it's too dangerous. The wind could blow you over the ridge. Stay put, keep the fire ready. He went out and the wind snatched the door from his hand, slamming it shut behind him. Clara bolted it, then went to the window. She watched his dark shape struggle through the snow, a shadow fighting a white monster. She waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The cold was seeping into the room. Then she heard it. A crack, sharp as a gunshot, not of wood, but of something else, and a shout that was swallowed instantly by the gale. Clara didn't think. She grabbed her shawl. She didn't look at her bad leg. She unbolted the door and threw herself into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and freezing her eyelashes instantly. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice sounding thin and pathetic against the roar of the wind. She fought her way through the drifts, dragging her bad leg, which felt like a lead weight. She found him 20 yards from the cabin. He was down, his face twisted in agony. The heavy woodpile, destabilized by the shifting snow, had collapsed. A massive pine log, soaked and heavy with ice, pinned his right leg to the frozen ground. "Go back," he roared when he saw her, waving her away. "Get inside! You'll freeze!" "No." Clara dropped to her knees, digging frantically at the snow around the log. "I'm not leaving you." "It's too heavy," Elias groaned, his face gray with shock. "Pinned me. Leg's broken. Can't move it." Clara looked at the pile. 3 heavy pine logs pinned his lower leg. Elias was a giant, a man of immense power, but he had no leverage. He was trapped. Clara looked around wildly. She couldn't lift it, she knew that. But she didn't need to lift it. She just needed to move it an inch. She spotted a sturdy ironwood branch lying nearby, stripped for fence posting. She grabbed it, her hands numb in the freezing air. She jammed the branch under the main log, using a flat rock as a fulcrum. "When I push, you pull," she screamed over the wind. "Clara, you're not strong enough." "Push!" she screamed, channeling every ounce of rage. Every year of being told she was weak. Every moment she had been pushed aside. She threw her entire body weight onto the lever. She pushed until stars danced in her vision. The log groaned. It shifted an inch. 2 inches. "Now!" Elias roared, a primal sound, dragging his leg free just as the lever slipped and the log slammed, back down with a bone-shaking thud. It was a nightmare crawl back to the cabin. Clara became his crutch, her bad leg burning with fire, but she refused to buckle. She dragged him, step by agonizing step, through the door. They collapsed onto the floor, gasping, as Clara kicked the door shut and bolted it against the storm. Then the real work began. Clara didn't panic. She went into a mode she had only ever watched her grandmother enter. She cut away his pant leg. The wound was deep, a jagged tear from a broken branch, and the bone was fractured. Blood was pooling on the floorboards. "It needs cleaning," she said, her hand steady now that the physical exertion was over. She went to her bag and pulled out a jar of sticky pine pitch and a small pot of honey. "What is that?" Elias gritted out, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Pine pitch to seal it. Honey to stop the rot," Clara explained, her voice taking on the authority of a doctor. "My grandmother taught me. The doctors in town just cut off limbs. We saved them." Elias watched her as she worked. He watched her melt the pitch near the fire, mix it with the honey, and apply the sticky poultice to the wound. He watched her set the bone, her touch firm but gentle, ignoring his grunts of pain. He watched her bind his leg with strips torn from her own petticoats. He had spent his life surviving by strength. He had wrestled bears and trapped wolves. But he had never known this kind of survival, the quiet, knowledgeable endurance of the healer. He realized then that strength wasn't just about muscle. It was about knowing what to do when the muscle failed. "You saved me," he whispered, the pain medication of the whiskey she had forced him to drink kicking in. "I bought you to scrub floors and you saved my life." "We saved each other," Clara said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "You gave me a shelter. I gave you a splint. That's a fair trade." That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted forever. Elias lay on the rug by the fire, unable to climb to his loft. Clara sat beside him, feeding him broth. He reached out and took her hand. His hand swallowed hers, but he didn't squeeze. He just held it, anchoring himself to her. He wasn't her master, and she was certainly no longer his servant. They were partners, bound by blood and snow. The beast had fallen, and the beauty had not fled. She had stayed to fight the monsters for him. Spring arrived with the violence of a thaw. The rivers swelled, roaring down the canyons, and the wildflowers, columbine and Indian, paintbrush, exploded across the meadows in riots of purple and red. Elias was back on his feet, though he walked with a slight limp now, a mirror to Clara's own. They moved around the cabin in a synchronized dance, two injured souls who had learned to compensate for each other's weaknesses. One afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats broke the peace. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, mud splattering their horses' flanks. In the lead was Josiah Vance, her father. Josiah looked cleaner, richer. He was wearing a new coat, likely bought with the silver from Clara's sale. He smiled when he saw Clara in the garden, her hands deep in the soil. "Well now," Josiah called out, reining in his horse. "Looks like you survived the winter, girl. And I hear stories in town. Trappers saying the ghost of the ridge has a woman who can cure her. Gangrene and cook like a French chef, saying she's worth her weight in gold." Elias stepped off the porch, his rifle in hand. He moved slower than before, but his presence was no less terrifying. "You're trespassing, Vance." "Not on family business," Josiah sneered, swinging down from his saddle. "I've been hearing she's valuable. I'm here to renegotiate. The law says a father has rights to his daughter's labor until she's wed or 21. She's only 19. She's my property." "There is no negotiation," Elias said, his voice ice cold. "We made a deal. She's not yours." "I'm taking her back," Josiah shouted, stepping forward. "I got a buyer in Denver who pays a premium for domestic help with her skills, a rich man who needs a nurse. I can get 10 times what you paid." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Indentured servitude was slavery by another name, a legal trap that could bind her for years. She looked at her father and saw only greed. "Get on the horse, Clara," her father commanded, pointing a gloved finger. "No," Clara said. It was soft, but it stopped him. She stepped forward, limping deliberately, owning her walk. She wiped the dirt from her hands. "I said no." "You don't tell me nope." "I am not your property." Clara's voice echoed off the canyon walls, startling the horses. "You sold me. You took the silver. You voided your rights the moment you walked away. You are nothing to me. I am your father." "You were my sire," Clara said, standing next to Elias. "But him?" She pointed at the mountain man. "He is my family. Because he knows my worth isn't in what I can do for him, but in who I am. He didn't push me from a loft. He pulled me from the snow." Josiah snarled, humiliated in front of his hired men. He reached for the pistol at his belt. Click. Elias raised his rifle, aiming directly at Josiah's chest. The movement was fluid, practiced. "Touch her," Elias said, "and I will bury you where you fall." "The snows have melted, Josiah. The ground is soft enough for a grave, and nobody asks questions about missing men in the high lonesome." The hired men with Josiah backed away, hands raised. They weren't paid enough to die for a family squabble. Josiah looked around, realized he was alone, and spat on the ground. "Keep her then," he hissed. "She's broken anyway. 2 cripples rotting on a mountain." He rode away, his back stiff with rage. Clara stood trembling as the sound of hoofbeats faded. Elias walked over, leaned his rifle against the rail, and cupped her face in his large hands. "Look at me, Clara," he said, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You saved my life. You turned a prison into a home. There's nothing broken about you. You are the strongest thing on this mountain." Clara leaned into his touch, and for the first time she believed him. The seasons turn and the mountains endure. Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by survival, but by living. One evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in hues of apricot and violet, Elias sat on the porch whittling. He blew the shavings off the object in his hand and held it out to Clara. It was a ring, not gold or silver, but carved from the heart of an ironwood branch, the same wood she had used to leverage the log off his leg. It was polished, smooth, dark, and unbreakable. "I don't have silver," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't have much of a name. Thorne is a name associated with ghosts and hermits, but it's yours. If you want it, I can't offer you society. Clara, I can only offer you this mountain and the man you saved." Clara took the ring. She ran her thumb over the wood, feeling its grain, its history. It was stronger than gold. It was made of the struggle that had brought them together. "Thorne isn't a name for ghosts, Elias," she said softly. "It's a name for things that survive, things that protect." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I want it. I want the mountain. And I want the man. They say if you hike the high trails of the Sangre de Cristo today, way up where the air is thin and the eagles circle, you might find the ruins of a stone foundation. And amidst the wild grass and the encroaching pines, you'll see something strange. Patches of garden yarrow and Domestic roses growing wild, flowers that shouldn't be there. They are the legacy of the mountain man and the goddess who saved him. A reminder that even in the harshest places, love can take root if you are brave enough to weather the storm. What an incredible journey, from a transaction of shame to a bond of unbreakable love. It shows us that sometimes the family we choose is far stronger than the one we are born into. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a rescue story. Check out the playlist on your screen right now. We have another incredible tale about a wolf who saved a lost child that you won't want to miss. I want to hear from you. What do you think was the bravest moment in Clara's story? Let me know in the comments. And if you have a story suggestion, send it our way. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright and your hearts open. Stay safe out there.